Welcome back to my channel. As the winter continues, and here in Michigan it is a very wintry winter, I'm continuing to talk about misinterpretations of ancient non-biblical literature and how these have played into the mistaken literary device views about the Gospels. Because remember, if these supposedly accepted compositional devices can't be found in ancient non-biblical literature, then the case is greatly weakened that they're found in the Gospels. Now, naturally, critical scholars think that they have other evidence of discrepancies and so forth, that somebody in the Gospels was changing facts or something like that. But the literary device view goes beyond that because it's supposed to save the gospel authors from the charge of an ordinary error or trying to deceive by saying, no, it's this whole accepted thing that everybody knew that these things in this genre were likely to change some facts, even if they couldn't tell where they were changed. And there are even specific devices like compression and transferal and so forth that were just accepted at the time. And so the audience would have just taken a lot of this stuff with a grain of salt, the way that we do when we watch a movie based on true events. So it's a very strong claim. It's not just the claim that there are discrepancies that can't be harmonized in the ordinary way in the Gospels, but it's the claim that they were deliberate, but also the claim that they weren't deceptive because these are accepted devices. Okay, so it's really strong, and it bears a strong burden of proof. And the burden of proof is supposedly met by finding them in ancient literature. Now, I have old other videos and long discussions in the Mirror of the Mask. Please look them up, about the so-called exercise books and how they supposedly listed and taught students that it was okay if they went on and did history to use these devices. That's all wrong too. It's just a wild misreading of what these exercise books are doing, and it leads to absurdities like claiming a divisive inflection, which involves making up extra people who weren't really present when in the context in the exercise book it's just having the students rewrite sentences to use different Greek numbers for, subjects and verbs and so forth. Is literally just a grammatical exercise. So it's like a complete failure to understand even the genre of exercise books. But in this more recent series right here, I've been going over a supposedly inductive case where beyond the so-called exercise books, we look at these ancient biographies and we find them using certain devices. But of course, the biographer himself isn't going to say, hey, by the way, I'm using this device. So saying that we're finding a device there is a conjecture, and the strength of that conjecture depends on other considerations. For example, can the differences between these biographies be harmonized in a reasonable fashion? Or could the author have just made a good faith mistake and so forth? And very often, a literary device theorist in New Testament studies like Dr. Lacona, or a classicist like Christopher Pelling, who influenced him a lot, is skipping all sorts of plausible explanations, such as mistake, just plain ordinary mistake, and to say, oh, look, there's a difference here. No, we're not going to harmonize it. It's a discrepancy. It was changed. Now we're going to say it wasn't a mistake. It was changed deliberately. And then we're going to say beyond that it was a device. Okay, so like all these possibilities just being skipped right over, going straight from an alleged discrepancy to a device. And today, as last week, I'm emphasizing that the last consideration we need to make in these non-biblical works is, are they trying to deceive someone? Because if they're trying to deceive someone, if the classical author is trying to deceive someone, then that's not a case of one of these compositional devices, because the whole point of these compositional devices is, no, they're not deceptive. They were just in this genre where they're allowed to make these changes, so people just expected them. Now, last week we talked about something that was just a verbal conversation that Lucian had with a couple of people whom he was secretly mocking by playing on their credulity and lying to them, and then he bragged about this in a letter to a friend. Well, that obviously doesn't support any kind of, accepted literary device. It's just plain old trolling, lying. This week I want to talk about an instance in the author Josephus, where it really looks like he is trying to bend the truth for a propagandistic reason for his own benefit. But that, again, is not a device. Deception is not a device. So I'm going to give you the background from Josephus. I give long quotes about this in The Mirror or the Mask from Josephus. So in Josephus' work, The Jewish War, he talks about a time when he was an official in what we would think of as the land of Israel, in the Galilee region. And in the Jewish War, he's very frank that as an official, he was actually in sympathy with the possibility of rebellion against Rome by the Jews. And he was actually drilling them and preparing them, trying to prepare them to fight against the Romans when what he saw as the inevitable fight with the Romans happened. Okay, so he's doing something that the Romans would presumably not like. Okay, fast forward some years, and he writes his autobiography. So it is a biography. It's his life of himself. Okay. And in this autobiography, his role in Galilee at that time period has changed miraculously. And he's saying, I was trying to keep the peace. I was helping them to arm themselves against robbers. And there were Galilean robbers. He even names one of them. But the idea is that, no, I wasn't in any way trying to prepare them to fight against Rome. I was just trying to keep the region peaceful, okay? And I think this is a lie. I'm just going to say that. This is propaganda. Now, I'm going to turn at this point to discussing an article. And I'm going to have a lot of nice things to say about this article. So if the author's watching, I believe he may be a Facebook friend of mine, though I don't see him posting a lot. This is an author named Henderson, and he's writing in an anthology called Biographies and Jesus. This anthology was edited by Craig Keener, and it's supposed to engage in this kind of inductive observation of ancient non-biblical biographies and then see what we can find out about the Gospels, because the Gospels have been identified as Greco-Roman biographies. So, this is supposed to somehow help us to find out the limits of the genre and the reliability that was expected from the genre. But again, it's just by reading them, by observing them. Now, some of the articles in this anthology by other authors are just eyebrow-raising. And as a short digression, one of them that I talk about in The Mirror or the Mask concerns the infancy stories in Luke. And the author concludes, I think without sufficient evidence, that Plutarch made up an instance in the childhood, an incident in the childhood of a general named Coriolanus, and then he just, who lived a long time before Plutarch. He couldn't have, been in as close touch as Luke would have been even with Jesus' infancy. And then the author just, takes this big leap and suggests that Luke may have made up whole incidents in the infancy of Jesus. And, just published in there. You wonder, and this is apparently a student of Dr. Keener. You wonder if Dr. Keener, who's famous for defending the reliability of Luke, at any point said to the student, I don't really think Luke made up, I don't think, you can draw that conclusion, like even said it to him, who knows. So some of the articles in this anthology really blow the doors off of the claim that the Greco-Roman biography thesis is somehow helpful to gospel reliability because there were strict limits, to how far they could go. On the contrary, to strict limits, that author was concluding that this licensed Luke to make up whole incidents in Jesus' childhood. Okay, end of digression. But back to Henderson's article on Josephus, it's much, much better than that. And he's even using some of the categories, just common sense categories, like, sometimes he harmonizes Josephus. Sometimes he suggests a possible just error, of memory or something like that. So quite a reasonable article and argument. And he concludes, I think rightly, that Josephus is deliberately bending the truth in this instance concerning his own role in Israel. And he suggests that that's because Domitian was reigning at the time and that Josephus was afraid of Domitian. Josephus kind of wanted the Romans to at least not hate him. He had kind of an in with the Romans and he wanted to continue that. Well, obviously that's propaganda for personal gain, right? Or at least personal self-protection, okay? And so can it be an accepted convention of the genre? So my one quibble with Henderson's article comes at the very end. Each one of the articles in this anthology ends in a somewhat similar fashion, and I'm pretty sure it was an editorial instruction to them, like, draw a moral at the end. What sort of moral can we draw from what you are observing in these ancient biographies? And Henderson says that no difference in the synoptic gospels is as great as this particular one, which is good. And then at the very end he says, Josephus' work therefore stands as an example of the range of variation that might have been accepted in the genre of ancient biography, though we cannot say for certain whether he would have been seen to exceed the limits of this range. So it's a cautious conclusion. My quibble is that if he's right, as I think he is, about Josephus trying to deceive the Romans by whitewashing his past, then by definition, what he's doing can't be an accepted literary or compositional device, part of an accepted genre that is just part of a range of variation that might have been accepted, because the whole point of a range of things that you could do that were accepted in a genre is that they aren't deceptive. So it's like, by definition, deductively, it's an entailment. If the author's trying to deceive somebody by what he does, then he can't simultaneously be writing in a way that doesn't deceive anybody at that point in his work, because everybody knew that these kind of changes would be made or could be made, and everybody was just, kind of taking loosely his presenting of the facts because they knew they could be partially factually changed. If everybody knew that, then he's not deceiving anybody. And conversely, if he's trying to deceive somebody for some reason, then everybody didn't know, because that person or persons, or, in this case, maybe Domitian, maybe Domitian's advisors, other Romans, think that what you're saying is the truth. In this case, that Josephus was just a peacekeeper in Israel, and no, he wasn't getting people ready to rebel against Rome at all. If Henderson's right about this, and I think he is, I guess Josephus would just be like, oh man, we just better hope they don't read the other thing that I wrote where I admit that I was, drilling them to fight against the Romans. But, I suppose you could hope for that. And what he writes really does give a completely different impression. So it's propaganda for himself. So it literally cannot be an accepted convention of the genre, because propaganda is intended to deceive. Now, we saw a far more extreme example of this last time, a confusion about this, where Licona listed Lucian's trolling of these credulous people as if it was part of an inductive list that supported an apocalyptic convention when people died, that amazing things were said to happen, but nobody believed that those amazing things had really happened, which he's using concerning Matthew and the raising of the saints. So no, it's not deceptive at all. It's an apocalyptic convention. Okay, but Lucian can't support that because Lucian's lying to these guys, and he's even laughing about it behind their backs. And that's a very extreme example of this kind of blinkered, utter confusion. Like, how could anybody think that this supports a non-deceptive convention? But here in this anthology, we see something that's just a little bit similar. Even in this cautious conclusion, Josephus' work therefore stands as an example of the range of variation that might have been accepted in the genre of ancient biography, though we cannot say for certain whether he would have been seen to exceed the limits of this range. I also want to mention right here that there are ways of accepting what a person does because you sympathize with them that don't make what that person did a convention. So suppose we imagine, it's totally hypothetical, but suppose we imagine some acquaintance of Josephus who reads both the Jewish War and the autobiography and sees the discrepancy and figures, he's trying to avoid getting in hot water with Domitian. And that person says, poor old Josephus, he felt like he had to do that. And is kind of lenient about it. Considers that there are mitigating circumstances. That still doesn't make it an accepted convention of a genre, okay? Because this hypothetical sympathetic person, he's not accepting it because it's part of a genre and nobody will be misled. He's accepting that poor old Josephus felt like he needed to mislead Domitian and or his advisors. So there's a kind of cynicism there that is, in one sense accepting, but is not supporting the convention of a genre. All right. Now, I conclude in this way. I'm going to read a partially altered passage from The Mirror or the Mask. I really encourage you to get a hold of The Mirror or the Mask. The theorists are attempting to make an inductive case from the works themselves, and when we turn to the documents, we do not find esoteric patterns supporting arcane devices. Instead, we find mundane, often pointless variation of precisely the sort that history and witness testimony in all ages abounds in. Indeed, and this is an important point that I make repeatedly in the book, if we were to apply consistently the methods used by Licona and some classicists, we would virtually erase normal variation and discrepancy due to human limitations, varied interests, and error. Again and again, the conclusion that an author was using a literary device depends upon jumping ahead in line, neglecting far simpler explanations arising from daily human experience. Even in the very few cases where sensible harmonization fails, and there is also strong reason to think an alteration was deliberate, we must remember that human experience includes the fact that sometimes people lie and engage in propaganda. At this point, there is no reason to believe that audience-accepted, fictionalizing literary devices of transferal, displacement, compression, and fabrication of details existed at all in the time of Plutarch, Josephus, and the Gospels. and if they didn't exist, then the gospel authors can't be using them. In fact, the only thing I found that could even be somewhat similar, and I'm waiting, for all the Kona followers leap on this with a cry of exultation, would be the making up of speeches. I have a whole chapter on that in The Mirror or the Mask. But that doesn't automatically okay, and I don't think the gospel authors did make up speeches. I'm not saying that I think they did, but other authors sometimes did. And there was a range, and some authors were like, no, you should never do that. And I think we have good evidence that the gospel authors, including Luke, who's the one most likely to have known that some authors made up speeches, were trying to follow the stricter standard of not making up speeches. Okay, but we've got all these other supposed devices, right? Transferal, displacement, compression, fabrication of details, what I've called dyschronological change, time change, and so forth. And those carry their own burden of proof. And that burden of proof for their existence at all, even in non-biblical literature, has not been met. All right, I'm going to make this video just slightly longer than I usually do by going at this point into a gospel example that I think fits well with this concern about deception. Not that I'm saying that the gospel authors were deceiving, but that if the literary device claim about this passage were true, then on the face of it, it would be a deception. And this concerns whether one of the thieves on the cross repented. Okay, so if you know your stories of the crucifixion, you know that the thieves mock Jesus. They join with the passersby in mocking Jesus. But in the Gospel of Luke, we're told that one of the thieves rebuked the other thief and says, we're justly condemned, and turned to Jesus and said, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And there's kind of interesting faith for you, because here's Jesus hanging on the cross. And Jesus said, this day you will be with me in paradise. Okay, so there's that story of the repentant thief. Now, this story is not found in Mark. And Mark uses a plural, and Matthew uses that same plural, possibly following Mark, that the thieves who were crucified with him reviled him. In Dr. Lacona's discussion of this, he exaggerates that into a discrepancy, because he insists that the interaction between Jesus and the thieves is portrayed as occurring at one point, and only one point, in Jesus' crucifixion. And you couldn't have both thieves reviling him and one of them repenting at that very same time. So because he insists that Luke and Matthew and Mark are all talking about that very same moment in the crucifixion, that then we got to do something else with it. Okay, and he suggests an alternative. This is a very common thing he does in Why Are There Differences in the Gospels, where he just kind of gives you an alternative, and he's definite that it's one of those two things, but he doesn't tell you which one he's concluding. So the one alternative would be that Luke, as I've called it, dyschronologically moved the conversion of the second thief, okay, to a different time from when it actually occurred. And then the other alternative is that Mark suppressed the conversion of one of the thieves, deliberately suppressed it so as to portray Jesus as rejected by all. In The Mirror or the Mask, I discuss the rigidness, so you want to talk about being rigid and black and white thinking and all that stuff, of the interpretation of time here, and that actually it's clear that these events that Mark is talking about are taking place over a period of time of about 3 hours. So there's plenty of time for if we take that plural, and the plural could also be just a figure of speech. Remember, a figure of speech is not the same thing. Like when I say people on Facebook are doing this, I may mean just one person. But let's suppose that the thieves plural in Mark is not just a careless figure of speech, but is meant to say that Mark has reason to believe that at one point both of the thieves were mocking Jesus. Okay? That could be happening, but since he's describing events that are taking place, he talks about other people mocking Jesus, and it's a progressive verb, that could be taking place over a period of time, and that's time enough for one of the thieves to change his mind and change his view by reflection, by watching what Jesus does on the cross and so forth. And the conversation in Luke then could have happened. Now, we don't know that Mark even knew about that conversation. Peter wasn't at the foot of the cross. Peter was probably Mark's source for many of the things in his gospel. So, let's not make an argument from silence that Mark had to even know about this. That's probably the simplest explanation. He didn't even know about it. And sometimes things just aren't, salient that someone mentions them. Okay. But the idea that he knew and he deliberately suppressed it to portray Jesus as rejected by all. I want you to think about that. Let's suppose Mark really did that. I don't think he really did that. But hypothetically, suppose he did that. How does that make that point? How does that give that appearance to Mark's audience if his audience doesn't think that Jesus really was rejected by all? Let's suppose that Mark's audience, let's imagine this very complex thing. His audience knows about the conversion of the thief. And they know it's mentioned in another gospel. But they hear Mark being read aloud, as it often was, and they notice that he doesn't mention the conversion of the thief. But they say to themselves, this is in a convention of Greco-Roman biography, and so people sometimes change things for thematic reasons. So I perceive that Mark suppressed the conversion of the thief on the cross. Well, at that point, they know Jesus wasn't rejected by all. Okay, so what value is it for Mark to try to make it look like Jesus is rejected by all if his audience doesn't believe that Jesus is rejected by all, including both of the thieves? If Mark is making both thieves revile Jesus, let's put it a different way, when he knows that one of them didn't, that instead one of them repented, so he's changing it, making a sympathetic thief into an unsympathetic thief. How does that cause his audience to say, wow, yeah, Jesus was really rejected by everybody, even the two people crucified with him? They're not even sympathetic. They're both, mocking him and so forth, if they don't believe it. So what we see here again is this tin ear, this blindness that cannot see that deceptions are not devices. If Mark is doing what Lacona suggests in this one alternative of the two things he suggests, then Mark is deceiving. And that's not a device, because Mark would have to be deceiving in order to have the desired effect. Just like Josephus would have to be trying to deceive the Romans in order to have his desired effect. In which case, the indignant claim that this doesn't portray the gospel authors as being deceptive in any way turns out not to stand up. The harmonization I've suggested would make a lot more sense than that, because this claim of his deliberately portraying the thief incorrectly is a very heavy claim. It's a very content-heavy claim. And the mere use of the plural describing the thieves at some point during those 3 hours and absence of the account of the thief's conversion is far from sufficient to support this very heavy claim about his deliberately suppressing that and changing the thief to a mocker. Okay, so I wanted you to see this, to see how this blindness carries over to the Gospels. And I think I'm probably going to do that as well with a Gospel example concerning where I think there is a good faith error. But I haven't definitely decided if I'm going to do that next time. So come back next time to see what we're doing here on the Lydia Migru channel, where we're making common sense rigorous.